MysteryWire.com, home of the unusual and unknown. From Area 51 to the paranormal, it's your source to the most vetted UFO stories and special investigations in the world. Take a journey into the universe of MysteryWire.com.
Rich Hoffman, obviously we're going to talk about UFOs, UAP issues, and your long-term interest in that. Before we jump into that deep end of the pool, can you describe what you do for a living, who you work for?
Yeah, I'm basically a senior engineer analyst working in what they call it's the CIO organization of Army Material Command. Army Material Command is located here in Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. And so I've been with them for like about 26 years. We originally were up in the DC area, and we relocated with the Base Relocation and Closure Act down here to Huntsville. And it's been a good move. Actually, it's a great area. We just got, by the way, the Space Command. The Space Command just came here to Huntsville, and I don't know if you know it, but the FBI headquarters is coming down here too.
So you're in the heart of some pretty sensitive stuff.
Yeah, we have the Marshall Space Flight Center here, where we're actually working with the commercial development of rockets. They actually call Huntsville Rocket City, and that's the reason. It's just so big around that. And so it's like a little Silicon Valley where you've got like all these like tech companies like Lockheed Martin's and you name it that are all around us. And so it's a really exciting place to be.
And as a systems analyst, what kinds of systems do you analyze?
Well, let me give you an example. We've got something on the scale of, with Army Material Command, we manage like a huge footprint across the entire continental United States, as well as other places, European and what they call OCONUS. And there's I think we're like something about 1,100 systems that we've got. And what I do is help to look at the footprint to see whether some of these systems can be combined and more enterprise based. And we're moving and migrating into the cloud, which is now taking us away from having individual systems located in data centers at every location. And so we're, with that whole thing going on the Hill about whether it's going to be Microsoft or whether it's going to be another company that's out there competing to be able to have the cloud work, we're trying to be able to move our systems into a cloud-based setting. So it's very technical. It tends to be more like I'm considered to be the systems guy, which means that there's all these systems, and I've got the great understanding of what they do and where they came from, and because I've been around so blasted long.
You're kind of like a secret identity guy. You have there's Rich Hoffman, the systems analyst working with the Army and rockets and things like that. And then there's Rich Hoffman, the UFO UAP guy. I have seen you for years at UFO events and conferences and things.
Yeah.
Not only do you stand out because you wear a tie, but because it's a bow tie. But I had until we spoke recently, I had no idea how long you had been at this. 56 years. So.
Yeah, it's in April. Believe it or not, it's kind of an interesting story you might not have heard before, but I was in 8th grade science class in 1964, and I was told to do a report on a subject that was on a list of different subjects, and I was late to class, and everybody else put their name next to the subject, and the only thing that was left was UFOs, and I didn't know what that was. Had no idea. Went up after the class, and I asked my teacher, and I said, "Hey, Mr. Bayshore, what is UFOs?" And he said, "Well, you ever heard of flying saucers?" I said, "Yeah, I watch science fiction movies." And now I'm living in Dayton, Ohio, just down from where Project Blue Book was, right? And I had no idea that was going on. And anyway, bottom line was I gave my book report, and it was on or about April 24th, 1964. And I don't know if you know what the significance of that date, but that's the Socorro incident.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, so here I am. I'm giving my presentation, and I'm very naive. And I said, well, certainly if there was anything to this thing, I think the Air Force would tell us something, right? They would be very open and let us know. And I didn't, I think I probably picked up a book that was probably like My Trip to Venus or something like that, because I didn't really come across very well. my teacher was very, very astute in the subject and asked me questions. Well, what about military jet pursuits? So I said, well, that wasn't in anything I read. Well, you know, anyway, after I got my D on that report, I went home that evening and I literally was watching as Walter Cronkite came on and was talking about the Socorro case. And it just hit me like, wow, there really is something to this. I should look into it. And a couple days later, I had an aunt that took me over to Wilkie's bookstore in the center of Dayton, Ohio. And I went up to somebody and I said, hey, do you have any books on UFOs? And they said, yeah, over here. Well, the bottom line was the book that I picked up was Captain Edward Ruppelt's The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. And I read that and oh, this is the jet pursuits he was talking about. Oh, this is this. And, you know, and then I learned, well, wait a minute, there's a project that's just up the road at Wright Pat called, and believe it or not, this is the funny thing. I'm in the Air Force Material Command, and that was the Army Material Command, and that was the Air Force Material Command that project was located under. So I've gone full circle, if you would. But anyway, so I ended up giving, like I said, well, not getting a good grade on that report. But I did get hooked on the UFO subject. And then after that, I began collecting materials. And then by the time I was about 15 years old, I was going around the city of Dayton giving lectures on this subject. I mean, and then to top that off, Phil Donahue had me on his show. And now I'm a 15-year-old talking about UFOs in the city of Dayton, and I'm with Phil Donahue. Well, that propelled me off into like, I got phone calls about ghosts. I got anything that went bump in the night, I started getting. And I said, I can't keep up with that stuff. And I'm into UFOs. And so I'm just focusing on that. So that's my story, George. Now you've heard it.
I need to look for that Phil Donahue clip. If you still have it, maybe send it to me. It's got to be.
Are you kidding me? They didn't even have any kind of video recording equipment in 1964. Oh, that's a shame. I'd like to have it, but anyway, I never got it.
Well, let me ask you this then. So have the two worlds ever collided for you? Have you had pushback from your more sensitive work for the Army and military? No pushback at all?
None whatsoever. You know, it's really funny. I wish I could show you if I could go over and get this picture, I'd be able to put it up and show it to you. But somebody made a caricature of me at work, and my whole desk cube area is filled with UFOs and UFO things around, including that good old thing that, you know, like Mulder had, for example, with, you know, the UFOs and I do believe, or whatever it was. Anyway, they made a caricature of me, which is all about UFOs. I'm sitting on a rotating or a levitating chair. I've got a little alien down on below me and everything else. So I've never had any conflict. I'm completely out in the open. In fact, what I found was that I actually started to receive a lot of great stories.
From military people. From military?
Yeah, you got it. I mean, I've had some incredible stories, and it was very much like what I experienced even in Dayton, because I actually went to FTD area and I delivered a presentation on UFOs to them. And they were coming up at like breaks and asking me a lot of UFO questions and stuff like that too.
FTD, Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson, which is supposedly the heart of the UFO cover-up.
Yeah, you got it. And here I am. I asked to come over and to talk to them about UFOs, and well, that sounds pretty interesting. Let me do that.
You should have led them on a tour down into the underground facilities and stuff.
Yeah, let's all go to Hangar 18 and discuss this.
So you are a co-founder of a relatively new UFO organization, SCU, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. You know, the world already has MUFON, FUFOR, CUFOs. Why was there a need for SCU?
Well, let's put it this way. Okay, so I've been with many organizations. In fact, I was the state director. I was the director of deputy director of investigations and the director of research or scientific strategic projects, as they call it, for MUFON. I've been with MUFON when it was still the Midwest UFO Network. Okay, so I've been with them for a long time. In fact, I'm a benefactor, and so I've got a lifetime membership. So I played in that world. I was also with other organizations like Ohio UFO Investigators League, which was a group that we had way back, and I was the director of investigations for that. I was with GSW, Bill Spalding. You remember?
Ground Saucer Watch, right?
Ground Saucer Watch. And so I've been with a lot of different organizations. And in my role with the MUFON over the years, you go through these different periodic changes of like leadership, and their direction shifts in a different way. And I was on the staff for Jan Harzen, so I was actually helping to try to improve overall investigations within the organizations by putting in procedures and processes to be able to make it better, if you would. There was a lot of that I did with them for a long time. And there was a number of us, like Robert Powell. There was Morgan Bell from Florida. He was a state director. Robert was our director of research for MUFON. You had also a gentleman by the name of Carl Paulson, who was a physicist that was with MUFON. And you also had Larry Cates that were all part of that as well. The five of us are basically the founders of SCU. We're the ones that kind of got it going. And the reason why we did it was because, I don't know if you're aware, but there was they were putting on shows like Hangar 1, and that was going on. And right after that, there were these pushes into this thing like secret spaceship programs and various other things. Well, a lot of the conspiracy angles don't set well with scientists. And we started to see scientists that were walking out the door of MUFON saying, I don't want to be a part of it. And that's a concern, because if science walks out the door, then what do you got? In addition to that, if you look at the database that they had collected with MUFON, it's like, on the scale of about easily over 80,000 cases. And Robert Powell put in a program that was called the Science Review Board, where he had scientists, and we would, once a month, me and Morgan and Robert and a number of others would go into actually looking in the MUFON database and calling out what we deemed were the best cases. The ones with the most, data or something you could do anything with. And so we started calling that out. We started going through and analyzing the cases. And then what would happen was we would make our recommendations that these are hot cases. They would then go to the scientists, if you would, to be able to look at those cases to see if we could develop them further and get more information or make actual measurements on them. Well, you started losing the scientists, and nobody wants to be a part of this, conspiracy kind of angle. It's like that, plus if you couple in the John Ventry fiasco and all the other kinds of things that MUFON was experiencing, and the fact that we were struggling to be able to get it more scientific when they wanted to go more marketing. It led us into changing and deciding that it would be best if we took our science out of MUFON, if you would, and start looking collectively at globally around the world and getting access to data that we can do. And we can do that very independently and be like a think tank. Coupled with that was the fact that the Aguadilla case happened. And that was in April 25th of 2013.
Right.
And so what happened was we got access, actually, one of us got access to that case via another MUFON person. And they got it from a pilot located in Miami who was not the pilot who witnessed it, but worked for Homeland Security and knew the pilot that was down in Aguadilla or in Puerto Rico. And apparently they had attempted to go and to take the video that they had captured of this strange object and this experience. And they tried to pass it up their food chain, if you would, up to Homeland Security. Well, Homeland Security said, well, we don't look into this stuff. You pass it down. They also attempted to go up to the Air Force Intelligence, and Air Force Intelligence said, well, we don't do anything with UFOs anymore or whatever like that. So bottom line was that the pilots down there said, well, we can pretty much go anywhere with this, right? And in fact, they were encouraged to go to maybe a UFO organization. Well, that's kind of like how it then got passed up to Miami. But there was a stipulation. They wanted to make sure that we do not really represent, they wanted scientists who are knowledgeable about UFOs, but not necessarily that we take it through MUFON channels. They wanted it to be scientifically looked at, not UFO related, because again, the stigma that goes along with UFOs, right?
Right.
So we pulled a team together, and that's those names I mentioned. And we just got together and said, well, we're going to, what do you want us to do? Sign NDAs? And yep. And by the way, they had done background checks on us to actually see that we could actually come in and work on this very well. And we passed that, and we basically honored the fact that we're not going to talk about the witness's name, and we're not going to give that, but we wanted to do this scientifically. So we spent 2 consecutive years analyzing 7,027 frames of a 3-minute and 54-second video from that Aguadilla case. And we were going like down to the pixel level, looking to see if we could make out any kinds of determinations. And in that experience, you had to also factor out the fact that the parallax effect, because now what you've got is an object that's rotating around an airplane. So you've got that kind of like pinwheel or that kind of thing going on. And so we had to take that into consideration. And we tried to look at everything from the thermal aspects of the camera. I was able to identify, because I'm in the DOD, that was L3 was the camera. It was a Westcam camera. And I was able to get model information and all that stuff. Another person was focusing on the water transit scene. And can we determine speeds of it moving through the water? And did it really go into the water? Did it make a splash when it went in? And we were looking at pixels to see if we could see splash indicators. And we also saw it in moving underneath the water. We said, well, what's that about? You know, how do you have an object that's below water showing this in thermal? Well, the thing is, if you think of, there's a thing called a Bernoulli hump that you experience where the water, it's moving underwater, it's displacing the water around it, and you now get a rise, and that change in temperature would allow you to be able to factor out that, well, okay, that's what the object is doing. It's moving underwater. It's actually displacing the water on the top, and it's changing the temperature, and that's what you're seeing, a ghost thing. So we literally tore that whole thing apart many, many ways, looked at it multiple thousands of times, and produced our report. And after we did that, well, guess what? MUFON wasn't very happy, right? Because we published a report, and here all of us were MUFON, and we didn't take it through. So we were all called, I mean, at least Robert and I were called into a meeting with the board, and we explained to them that not everything goes through MUFON when the witness says they don't want it to go through MUFON. And they were they respected that in the end. And they appreciated the fact that they, didn't want that to happen that way. But it ultimately led us into talking about the fact that what we need to really do is probably move out of MUFON and start our own organization, which we then did. And it was originally called the Scientific Coalition for Ufology, but we changed it now recently over to the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, which focuses on what we're really doing.
The Aguadilla case, I want you to describe, for those who are not familiar with it, what evidence you were analyzing and what conclusions you came to. And that paper is on the SCU website, by the way.
It is.
And then,
and the video.
Discuss it in the context of, there is stuff to study. Scientists and scientifically minded people can study this if they want to. Not every case, not every UFO sighting can be studied to that degree, but some can. And there is evidence that can be analyzed. And this paper that you developed proves it.
Yeah, the significance of that particular video for us, George, is, and as we compare that to all the many thousands of things that are reported and sent up into MUFON. I mean, most of those are like an iPhone, or some sort of like movie camera or whatever like that. But it's taken by not necessarily many of them are just like lens flares and not photographers. On the Aguadilla case, you were talking about something that was actually in the thermal ranges of the spectrum beyond the visible. So now you're starting to say, well, I'm looking in a different thing that I can't normally see. And so it was important that way. Number two, it's taken with a military grade camera, you know, and this Westcam camera. And so that was a rarity, along coupled with the fact that you had that, again, thermal range. And so, and with all that wonderful metadata, if you've seen the video, it's like the FLIR and like the gimbal and all those, where you have metadata on the screens that tells you where the aircraft's location is in a GPS nature. It tells you its flight speed or its altitude. And those are the things that you really want to be able to get to study that you don't get from somebody that's using their iPhone camera to, you know, take a picture of a light at night, which is not going to give you anything to go on. It's just, you know, and so the fact that we had thermal, we could actually see the actual object of it and where its temperature deviated, because basically your thermal is looking at what they call temperature contrast. And the camera itself can actually detect, and this is how sensitive those cameras are, 1/100th of a degree difference in temperature. That's how precise these things are. So, I mean, with that, you know, all that stuff combined, and after the, you know, the God knows the 56 years that I've been engaged in this, I had never seen a video like that before. I mean, it's rare that we ever get anything with, again, the metadata there and that kind of information. And so we all decided 2 years is just, I mean, we're going to spend as long as it takes to be able to do that.
So what's the conclusion? What was it?
So, you know, like anything, you know, and Hynek was talking about this back, I saw him back in the late 60s in Dayton at the Engineer Club. And I went and like listened in on that conversation. And he was talking about there's what they call a de-escalation of hypothesis. And so you start off with a hypothesis that says that it's something like you can explain it. And you take out everything that you can possibly try to account it being naturally. And you get down to the point where the only conclusion is that it's something else. it's an unknown, right? And Hynek was big about the fact that you don't call a UFO until after you've investigated it. And if it remained not an IFO, then it was a UFO. So that's how he looked at it. And I grew up with him and all that whole way of thinking. And so that's what we apply. And so we're doing it. We said, well, what can it logically be? Well, what flies like this? What splits into two? What has this color temperature or this temperature range that we're talking about? Obviously, we looked at it, and there's one, the beginning of it, it looks like it's a tumbling balloon. But you don't know, and that's how we look at it in the visual range. In the thermal range, it could be completely different. That could be the temperature changing around it. Did it look like it had any kind of an indication of a propulsion system? Because guess what? The wind speeds at the altitude that this thing was everywhere from like 15 to 18 miles an hour, heading from the northeast to the southwest, right? And this object was moving around and into the wind. Okay, well, looking again for propulsion, didn't see any propulsion systems on it. And then we said, could it be a balloon? And what does a balloon look like in thermal? And we actually have a friend of ours we reached out to, Dave Fulch, who was as a FLIR technician, and he even had the Westcam camera, and he went out and literally took pictures of a balloon, a Mylar balloon type thing, and what it looked like in just a very small, like 4 mile per hour wind, and he had it tied down, and this thing was going like crazy every which direction, and the thermal match was not there at all. Okay, well, so that wasn't it. And by the way, have you ever heard of a balloon splitting? No, well, you know, and you get where I'm going, right? So we then said, well, could it be a bird? You know, well, let's go look at we have pictures of birds in thermal. Well, it doesn't match up, you know. So you keep going down the list of all the things that could potentially be. And number one thing is that, you know, how many things split into two identical pieces?
Why don't you describe the sequence of events that are shown on the film for those who don't know?
No problem. So let me tell you the story. Back up here. It's about 9 o'clock in the evening. It's completely pitch dark, and this is in April, so it's still pitch dark, and this is in Puerto Rico, and a Dash 8 aircraft loaded with 4 different people on board. It's a crew of 4. You have a pilot, co-pilot, you have a radar operator, and you also have a camera operator that are sitting in the back. And they're off on a drug smuggling mission. You know, that's what Homeland Security does. There's a lot of activity with that kind of thing down in Puerto Rico. And so ultimately, they're taking off from the Rafael Hernandez Airport, and they're going from, the airport kind of goes from a southwest to a northeast. So when you're taking off, you're going directly into that wind that I talked about, right? So it was about 9 o'clock in the evening. There's a full moon, and there are about 50 hits of radar out in the water just to the north, a little bit more to the west of that airport, just offshore. And there's these 50 hits of this object that's doing some incredible changing and maneuvers, and in and of itself is pretty wild. And then you've got about 9:16 or so, this plane is now taking off, and it's starting to gain, it's got cleared for takeoff. It's now up at just maybe about 400 feet or so. The pilots are now looking over, and they're seeing a light, a pinkish white light that is now coming in from the ocean and toward the airport. And it's going to be right in the flight path that they're going to go off on. And so they contacted the tower and said, I thought you had us cleared for takeoff, and what is this? And they said that they saw the light as well from the control tower. So the crew decided that they would fly around it in a big circle. And so they started flying counterclockwise in a circle around the airport, and they were watching this thing. Well, the light then goes off. And they thought, well, okay, this could be drug smugglers, because that's one of the things that they do. They turn off their lights and they drop their drugs or whatever they're going to do. And so they kept going around. And so when they get to about the same area where they actually took off of, when it went dark, the pilot contacted behind him the camera operator and said, turn on the thermal and let's record this. So now you got that camera operator who is now turning on his camera, and he's attempting to find that object. He finds the object and he starts to track it, and he's manually moving that around to be able to keep that in line. And so here's this object that is now coming in. And if you've ever seen in thermal ranges, it looks like daylight on the actual images of the video, but completely it's pitch black. Other than the fact that you have a full moon behind you, it's pitch black. Okay, so there might be a little bit of shadow and stuff like that, but it's very, very dark. So they watch this object on their screens as they're flying their plane in this circle, if you would, and they go around for the second time now. They've gone around once, they now go around for the second time, and then they start heading south towards and going on their mission, because they couldn't just keep doing this. They needed to go off. But by this time, the object appears that it goes around the airport, and in fact, the control tower stopped a FedEx plane from taking off. It was sitting there on the runway, and you see it in the video clip. It's sitting there, and it didn't get to take off until a lot later, so it was departing late. And then you see this object then swing back, and it comes up across the runway, or appears to come across the runway, and then it goes in, like you see a supermarket that's in the background, and then it starts to get lower in terms of its altitude, and it's now getting down towards the shore, and you see it in the water, and it's coming in, and it did almost like a full circle from the spot where it came in, and it's now going back to that same spot. And then you look at it, and you'll see that the object appears to go into the water. You lose sight of it on its thermal, and you then see like this white thing on the top of the water, and it's moving along. And then the next thing you see is the object appears to come up out of the water, and it's as dark as it was when it went in. And by the way, in thermal, black is hot and white is cold on this setting that they had on that camera. And so then it comes up and gets really, really dark. And then you see it split into two separate objects. And when you see that split, you're going like, what did I just look at, you know? And that's what they were doing. And the one object that was behind it split off of it. And then you see it kind of like go into the water and disappears. And the other one kind of hangs up for a minute and it slowed its speed down. And then it goes into the water. And so that's kind of like the gist of what happened. They went on their flight mission, did their drug smuggling run, whatever they did. They got back to the airport and they said, well, what did we just see? Scratching their heads. They were able to get a USB or something like that in there and somehow download it. And then what do we do with it from here? And that's kind of like the story of that. And we cover it in greater detail, of course. And there were other witnesses, by the way, ground. Then you had the control tower, and who also saw it. And one pilot was coming into work, and he was like seeing it in the sky. And so, anyway, that's the story.